It began with almost nothing, a small tribe on the edge of Anatolia, surrounded by fading empires and endless wars. They had no riches, no great cities, and no reason to believe the world would ever know their name. But they carried something far stronger: belief, courage, and a dream said to come from the heavens. From these forgotten frontiers rose a power that would one day rule across 3 continents, shape 2 worlds, and humble the mightiest of kingdoms. How did it all begin? How did a simple frontier tribe become one of history's greatest empires? You are watching Erahive, where history speaks. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind history's turning points, subscribe and join us on this journey through time. At the turn of the 14th century, Anatolia was a land broken by war and empire. The Mongols had crushed the Seljuks, leaving behind a patchwork of small frontier states called beyliks, each ruled by ambitious warlords fighting for scraps of a dying world. Among them was one of the smallest, led by a man named Osman, son of Ertuğrul Gazi, a frontier chieftain with little more than his horsemen, his faith, and his will. No one could have guessed that from this small beylik would rise a dynasty that would rule for 600 years. Ottoman legends say Osman had a dream. One night, while staying in the home of a holy man named Sheikh Edebali, he saw a moon rise from the elder's chest and sink into his own. From his heart grew a mighty tree whose branches spread across the world, sheltering all beneath its shade. When Osman awoke, Edebali told him the dream was divine, a sign that his descendants would build an empire unlike any other. Whether the dream was real or not, it became the Ottomans' guiding myth, a story of destiny and purpose that gave their conquests meaning. From that moment on, Osman was not just a frontier lord, he was a man chosen by fate. He began uniting the Turkmen tribes who roamed the western frontier, men hardened by years of war and exile. These were the Ghazis, warriors of faith, who fought not only for survival, but for something greater, to carve a place for their people between east and west. Their early victories were small, but they carried symbolic weight. In 1301, Osman's forces defeated a Byzantine army at the Battle of Bapheus, gaining control over villages near the key cities of Nicaea and Bursa. It was the beginning of a steady advance into Byzantine lands. As the Byzantines weakened, their old walls crumbled not just from battle, but from within: corruption, civil war, and exhaustion. And while most saw Anatolia as a graveyard of fallen empires, Osman saw something else: a frontier of opportunity. What began as raids turned into conquests. His men weren't fighting for plunder anymore. They were fighting for a vision. And when Osman finally passed his command to his son Orhan, the foundations of an empire were already in place. But Orhan's reign would bring something new: order, structure, and ambition. The Ottomans were no longer just frontier warriors. They were becoming a state. Conquests of Orhan and Murad. When Osman died around 1324, his son Orhan inherited not just a tribe, but a vision. The dream his father spoke of, a realm stretching far beyond Anatolia, was now his to shape. But first, he needed to turn a loose band of warriors into something far greater: a functioning state. Orhan was not a conqueror driven only by the sword. He understood that to last, power needed order. Under him, the Ottomans began minting coins, building mosques, and forming the first institutions that would give their rule structure. It was the birth of an organized Ottoman administration, still simple but stable enough to grow. In 1326, Orhan captured the great Byzantine city of Bursa after a long siege. Its fall marked the first major Ottoman victory and gave the young state a real capital. Bursa became more than a military prize. It was a symbol. The frontier raiders had taken their first city, their first foothold in civilization. From there, Orhan's armies moved swiftly. Nicaea fell in 1331, followed by Nicomedia in 1337. One by one, the old Byzantine strongholds of northwestern Anatolia surrendered. But Orhan's ambitions didn't end there. Through careful diplomacy and strategic marriages, he wove the Ottomans into the complex web of regional politics. He married Theodora, the daughter of the Byzantine regent John VI Cantacuzene, turning old enemies into uneasy allies. That alliance would change everything. When a Byzantine civil war erupted in the 1350s, Orhan's troops came to the empire's aid, and in return gained a foothold across the Dardanelles. At Gallipoli, in 1354, an earthquake shattered entered Gallipoli's walls. The Ottomans seized the moment, occupied the city, and refused to leave. For the first time, their banners flew in Europe. This was no longer a frontier beylik. It was an empire in the making. When Orhan's son Murad I took the throne, he inherited both the wealth of Anatolia and the promise of Europe. Murad was a soldier at heart, calm, pragmatic, but relentless. He moved the capital to Edirne, then Adrianople, placing it right between Asia and Europe, a statement of intent. Murad reorganized his forces, tightening control over the feudal lords and establishing the Janissaries, an elite corps drawn from the sons of Christian subjects through the Devshirme system. This controversial practice, taking boys, converting them to Islam, and raising them as loyal soldiers, would become the backbone of Ottoman power for centuries. Under Murad, the Ottoman tide surged into the Balkans. In 1362, Philippopolis and Adrianople fell. Within 2 decades, most of Thrace and Macedonia were under Ottoman rule. The Christian kingdoms of the Balkans, once divided by rivalries, now faced a single rising enemy. But the road to domination was not without blood. In 1389, at Kosovo Field, the Ottomans faced a coalition of Serbs, Bosnians, and other Balkan lords, led by Prince Lazar. The battle was fierce and costly. The Ottomans emerged victorious, but Sultan Murad was killed, stabbed, it's said, by a Serbian knight named Miloš Obilić, who feigned surrender to get close to him. Murad I became the first and only Ottoman sultan to die in battle. His death was a reminder that even destiny has a price. His son Bayezid, nicknamed Yıldırım, the Thunderbolt, now ascended the throne. The Ottomans had conquered cities, lands, and nations, but Bayezid would set his sights on something even greater, empire, and his ambition would take the Ottomans to dazzling heights and devastating collapse. Battle of Kosovo. The death of Sultan Murad on the field of Kosovo was more than a personal loss. It was a moment that tested the very spirit of the Ottoman state. Yet, from the smoke and ruin of that battlefield, a new ruler rose, Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt. Bayezid was everything his name suggested: swift, fierce, and unrelenting. His rule marked a turning point where the Ottomans shifted from a frontier kingdom into an empire of ambition. His first act as sultan was ruthless but decisive. He executed his own brother to secure the throne. In Ottoman politics, mercy could be fatal. Unity had to be absolute. With the Balkans weakened after Kosovo, Bayezid pressed forward. He forced Serbia into vassalage and swept through Bulgaria, bringing it under Ottoman control. He reorganized his armies, strengthened his administration, and, in a move that stunned Europe, began to encircle Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Empire, once the symbol of Eastern Christendom, was now a shadow of its former self, reduced to a few crumbling walls and desperate pleas for help. In 1394, Bayezid laid siege to Constantinople, tightening a noose that would not be loosened for decades. But while the Byzantines trembled, the rest of Europe began to stir. Pope Boniface IX called for a crusade, one of the last of the Middle Ages. Led by King Sigismund of Hungary, an army of knights from across Europe, French, German, Polish, and Hungarian, marched to stop the Ottoman advance. The two forces met in 1396 at the Battle of Nicopolis on the Danube. The Crusaders, confident in their heavy armor and noble pride, underestimated the disciplined Ottoman army. Bayezid's cavalry lured them into a trap, surrounding them on the steep banks of the river. The crusade collapsed in chaos. Thousands were captured. The victory at Nicopolis made Bayezid's name echo across the world. Feared in Europe, revered in the East. He built mosques in Bursa and Edirne, adorned with domes and calligraphy, symbols of a civilization rising from the frontier dust. Yet even at the height of his glory, fate was preparing a storm that would bring the Thunderbolt crashing down. Far to the east, beyond the Anatolian hills, a conqueror was on the move. Timur, the Turco-Mongol warlord who saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan. His armies burned across Asia, and soon his gaze fell upon Bayezid's swelling empire. Bayezid's rapid expansion had brought him wealth and power, but also enemies. The rival Anatolian beyliks, crushed under his conquests, saw a savior in Timur. In 1402, the two great powers collided near the plains of Ankara. Timur's elephants and seasoned veterans met Bayezid's cavalry in a brutal clash that decided the fate of the empire. By the day's end, the Ottomans were shattered, and Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, was captured. Legends say he died in captivity, broken and humiliated. Whatever the truth, his fall sent shockwaves through the Ottoman world. The empire, once unstoppable, now teetered on the edge of collapse. What followed was not conquest, but chaos, a bitter civil war that would decide whether the Ottomans would rise again or vanish into history. The year was 1402, and the once mighty Ottoman Empire lay in ruins. The defeat at Ankara had not just shattered armies, it had broken a dynasty. Sultan Bayezid I was gone, and his sons now turned their swords against each other. For 11 long years, the empire descended into chaos. It was a time historians call the Ottoman Interregnum, a civil war fought between Bayezid's 4 sons, Isa, Suleiman, Musa, and Mehmed. Each claimed the right to rule. Each was willing to spill a brother's blood to prove it. Cities changed hands again and again. In Anatolia, the once subdued Beyliks re-emerged, reclaiming their lands. In the Balkans, Christian kingdoms that had once bowed to Ottoman authority began to rise again. The empire Osman had dreamed of was crumbling faster than it had been built. And yet, even in this darkness, something remarkable endured. While princes fought, the Ottoman state itself did not vanish. Its system of administration, its army of loyal servants, and the very structure of governance survived. Historians believe this resilience came from an unusual source: the Devshirme, the youth levy that turned Christian boys into Ottoman administrators and soldiers. They were no longer tribal warriors loyal to bloodlines. They were trained to serve the state itself, and that loyalty, more than anything, kept the empire alive. In 1413, victory finally came. Mehmed Çelebi, the youngest and most capable of Bayezid's sons, defeated his brothers one by one. When he finally entered Edirne, the old capital, the fighting ended. He became Mehmed I, the restorer, the man who pieced together a broken empire. Mehmed ruled with patience and caution. He rebuilt alliances in the Balkans, restored trade routes, and carefully avoided conflict with Timur's successors in the east. He knew the empire needed time to heal, but peace in the Ottoman world was always fragile, and history, as ever, was moving faster than any one ruler could control. When Mehmed I died in 1421, his young son Murad II inherited both the crown and the burden of holding together a realm still scarred by civil war. Barely 20 years old, Murad was suddenly surrounded by rebellion, intrigue, and enemies, both foreign and domestic. His own uncle, Mustafa, declared himself the rightful sultan with the secret support of the Byzantines, who hoped once again to weaken the Ottomans from within. Murad crushed the rebellion, but the message was clear. Constantinople was still the empire's greatest thorn. That same year, he marched on the Byzantine capital and laid siege to it, determined to make it his. But once again, the old city stood firm. Its walls had seen centuries of war and survived them all. Murad lifted the siege and turned east to subdue the last rebellious Beyliks of Anatolia. By the mid-1420s, the Ottoman heartlands were whole again. Murad had restored unity, order, and faith in the empire's destiny. And yet, his reign would be defined not by peace, but by conflict, a struggle that would stretch from the mountains of Serbia to the plains of Hungary. For it was under his rule that the Ottomans would once more turn their eyes toward Europe and the long-awaited conquest that had haunted his ancestors for over a century. But before that dream could be fulfilled, one final test awaited, a war that would decide the fate of Byzantium itself. By the time Sultan Murad II sat firmly upon his throne, the Ottoman Empire was whole again, but the world around it was changing fast. The Christian kingdoms of the Balkans had grown wary of the empire's return. The Venetians guarded their sea routes jealously, and the Byzantines, clinging to survival in the last remnants of their ancient empire, watched every Ottoman move with fear and desperation. Murad's reign was marked by both war and weariness. He was not an emperor of luxury, but a soldier, shaped by rebellion and loss. And though he longed for peace, history gave him no rest. In the 1430s, the Ottomans reconquered Thessaloniki, once a proud Byzantine city now held by the Venetians. The siege was brutal, lasting years, the starving citizens caught between faith and survival. When the city finally fell, its population had been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. Murad, however, spared the survivors. To rule the Balkans, he understood, was not only to conquer, but to rebuild. In 1439, he annexed Serbia completely, bringing an end to its fragile independence. But the Christian powers of Europe refused to accept Ottoman dominance. A new crusade was called, one that would echo the last gasps of medieval Europe's defiance. In 1443, a coalition of armies led by John Hunyadi of Hungary and King Władysław III of Poland marched south, striking deep deep into Ottoman territory. For the first time in decades, the Ottomans faced a real challenge in the Balkans. Murad's forces withdrew strategically, conserving their strength while the Crusaders advanced through the frozen plains. But when the invaders grew overconfident, Murad struck back with devastating precision. In 1444, at the Battle of Varna, his disciplined army encircled the Crusaders. King Władysław charged recklessly toward the Ottoman lines, only to be cut down. His death broke the crusade. The battlefield fell silent, and the dream of driving the Ottomans from Europe died with him. Exhausted by years of war, Murad returned home and did something no Ottoman sultan had done before. He abdicated. He handed the throne to his 12-year-old son, Mehmed, and sought peace in retirement. But the world was not ready to leave him in peace. In 1446, a revolt broke out among the Janissaries, furious over reforms imposed by the young sultan. The empire teetered on the edge of chaos once more. The Grand Vizier Chandarlı Halil Pasha sent word to Murad, "Your empire needs you again." The old sultan returned, his banner raised once more. 2 years later, in 1448, he faced Hunyadi again, this time at the Second Battle of Kosovo. The clash lasted 3 brutal days. Both sides fought with desperation, but in the end, Murad's army stood victorious once again. The Balkans were quiet. Byzantium, now completely isolated, was left to await its fate. When Murad finally died in 1451, the Ottoman throne passed to his son, Mehmed II. The boy who had once been dismissed as too young, too naive, was now a determined ruler, and he carried one goal above all others: to end what his ancestors had begun. From the moment he returned to power, Mehmed worked with relentless focus. He reformed the army, reorganized finances, and built a fleet that could dominate the seas. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the Bosporus, Rumeli Hisar, designed to choke Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea. Every step he took made it clear the final siege was coming. By 1453, the stage was set. Within the ancient walls of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos prepared for the inevitable. His soldiers were few, barely 7,000 men, joined by a handful of Venetian and Genoese allies. Against them stood an Ottoman force numbering perhaps 70,000. Some say more. But it wasn't just numbers that mattered. Mehmed had something the world had never seen on such a scale: gunpowder. At dawn on April 6th, the Ottoman cannons roared to life. Among them was the legendary basilica, a massive bombard that hurled stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. The thunder of its fire echoed for miles. For weeks, the walls of Constantinople shook, cracked, and crumbled, but still they held. The Byzantines fought with desperate courage. They patched their walls by night, prayed by dawn, and clung to hope as the city's ancient mosaics looked down upon their final stand. For the defenders, this was not just a siege. It was the end of 1,000 years of empire. But Mehmed was patient. When the Ottoman fleet failed to breach the harbor, he ordered an impossible task: to drag his ships overland. Logs were laid across the hills north of the city, greased with oil and animal fat. Under the moonlight, hundreds of ships slid across the earth as if gliding over water. When dawn came, the Byzantines awoke to a sight they could scarcely believe: Ottoman ships sailing within the Golden Horn behind their own chain. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Waves of janissaries, artillery, and siege ladders stormed the battered walls. After hours of brutal fighting, a breach opened, and the city that had once been the jewel of the Roman world finally fell. Emperor Constantine fought until the end. His body was never found. And as the sun rose, Mehmed entered the city through the gate of St. Romanus, his horse stepping over the shattered stones of history. He rode to the great Hagia Sophia, where the voices of prayer and empire had echoed for a millennium. There, he dismounted, scattered dust upon his turban, and said softly, "Now it is ours." Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul, the new heart of an empire that would endure for centuries. And with its fall, the Middle Ages truly ended. From Osman's humble dream to Mehmed's conquest, the Ottomans had risen from nothing, guided by faith, shaped by ambition, and bound by destiny. Their story was not just one of conquest, but of transformation, a lesson that even the smallest spark, under the right winds of history, can set the world ablaze. From the dusty plains of Anatolia to the golden domes of Constantinople, the rise of the Ottomans was more than a tale of battles and kings. It was a story of endurance, a reminder that history is not written by those born powerful, but by those who dare to believe when the world does not. Osman's small band of warriors began with no promise of greatness, yet their courage, discipline, and sense of destiny carried them farther than any could imagine. Through centuries of turmoil, they built not just an empire, but a civilization that bridged continents, faiths, and ideas. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of one world and the dawn of another. And it began simply with a dream. If you've enjoyed this journey through history's turning points, support us by leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to help Erahive bring more forgotten stories to life. Because here, history doesn't just speak, it breathes. You've been watching Erahive, where history speaks.